maybe I should just go through this list so that you can correct my pronunciation or mispronunciation of your names, and that I get to have some sense of who you are. So let me do this quickly. Mohammed Rushdu Attash. Oh, good. Nasla Bhatt. Good. Sylvia Sanes. Sena Getche. But do correct me if I do damage to your name. Ezdi Nur Tanlik. Dilara Bastash. Hilal Teke. Asla Burfin Savash. Not here. Yagmur Ashur Siola. That's very challenging. Ahmed Mert Esser. Ilgin Bashe. Yashin Unal. Mohammed Saeed, Hassan Saeed, and Rukia Bahar Madoum. Good. And then I have Samia Genchak. Samia Genchak. Chuke Surikayo? No? And Virtue Safwan. Aiden Aslak. And Convert Genghis. Oh, John Dust. Oh. Rita Preston, that's very easy. Erjan Yusuf. Good. But you were probably too polite to correct me, but hopefully I'll do better. Let me just say something about the organization of the course and the requirements. The Middle East is an extraordinarily complicated region of the world in this period particularly. In the period since the end of the Cold War. It wasn't so complicated up until 1990. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States took over control, trying to exert external influence, you had two things happening at once. You had a change in the global way of trying to control developments in the region, with the sense that this was the most, after the Cold War, there was the idea in the West, and particularly in Washington, that the Middle East was more important than any other region. Europe had been the most important during the Cold War. But with the end of the Cold War, there was the sense that here was where the future of international political control would be determined. And that was for several reasons. The most important reason, as anyone have a good guess, what is the most important reason why it became so important? Oil, did you say? Yes, oil is the short word, but a long history. But it's not only oil. It was the interaction of oil with, am I too close or too far? Okay. It was the interaction of oil with a politically unresolved tension between Israel and the Palestinians, first of all, but also the Arab world, secondly. I mean, so you had this unresolved conflict at the core, with Israel trying not only to expand within historic Palestine, but trying to control the regional environment as well. So you had that combination. And then, perhaps most important of all in a political sense, you had the various outcomes associated with the Iranian Revolution that had occurred at the end of the 1970s, while the Cold War was still going on. But what it did was to create this sense that for the West, after communism, the real threat to its global position came from what was called political Islam. And it was the spread of this idea that political change of a more fundamental sort would come from religiously oriented activism. And that was threatening not only to the West, but to the secular governments in the region. And what surprised many people who didn't understand these issues very well, it was also threatening to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the monarchies in the region. And so Iran, ever since the revolution against the Shah that occurred in 1978-79, has projected an image of an alternative to both an alternative to secularism and an alternative to the sort of dynastic rule, monarchy. I was in Iran during the last stages of the Iranian Revolution and had the opportunity to meet with Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader. You know, the last day he was in Paris before returning triumphantly to Iran. And he said two things that are quite relevant to what I just said. he first said, this is not an Iranian revolution, it's an Islamic revolution. And by that he meant something that's very, I think, profound for the region. And that is that the real political community is premised on civilizational values and religious values. It's not based on the European kind of territorial state nationalism. See, and that's been a tension, I think, here ever since that moment in Iran in 1978, where there was this sense that something non-territorial was happening that had profound political implications for the existing order. And the other thing that Khomeini was very clear about was that the dynasties in the region, the monarchies in the Gulf particularly, were as opposed to the well-being of the people as was the Shah of Iran. So in other words, there was this combination of a strong endorsement of the Islamic idea of ummah, the community that is not based on territorial states, but based on values and cultural affiliation, combined with this idea that a governing process should not claim to be connected with a single family or with a idea of monarchy, that was a destructive political notion. And so you had the odd thing in Saudi Arabia that in one way was this most strict Islamic country in the world where women couldn't drive and lots of regulations that you're probably more familiar with than I am. The strictness of Saudi Arabia's Islamic kind of governing process did not give it protection against this more populist Islam that came from the people. See, the Saudi and UAE is Islam from above. And what was threatening to those governments, and it was obvious after the Arab Spring, was a democratically oriented Islamic movement of the sort that came to power in Egypt after the uprising against the Mubarak government in 2011. That was, you would have thought that that would be welcomed by Saudi Arabia, because here was a religiously oriented political party replacing a secular government as the Mubarak government. But instead, this was viewed very as a threat to the stability of the Gulf monarchies. And so, despite the so-called sectarian divide between Sunnis and Shia, what was really important was the divide between this Islam from above and Islam from below, between a populist Islam that produced the Iranian Revolution and elected, one can argue, the government in this country. That kind of political orientation as compared to this kind of dynastic collaboration between political leaders and the religious establishment. And so wherever there are dynasties, even if they're religiously oriented, they create a tension within the region. So that was the sort of third dimension of these issues that became so prominent in this, that made this region so prominent after the end of the Cold War. And the third, I think there is a fourth reason, and that is the concern about the spread of nuclear weapons. The justification for the attack on Iraq and the confrontation with Iran is not on these issues that I've been talking about, but rather is based on the idea that these countries might develop nuclear weapons, and that would be threatening to the stability of the region. And what makes this element problematic is that Israel already has nuclear weapons, and their nuclear arsenal was acquired by secret means or covert means, and yet it's not objected to. See, why the double standard? Why is it okay for Israel to have nuclear weapons, but a cause of war if Iraq or Iran seek to acquire nuclear weapons? So that's another reason why this region has become so important. So this is broadly what I've been trying to say is that in order to understand world politics at this time, it's really important to have some grasp of these major developments within the Middle East and how they relate to the history of the region and to its culture and political identity. So that, in a sense, what the course is about is to try to think about these issues in connection with the various countries that compose the region, but admittedly in a way that on the one side tries to look at the specific nature of the tension in Yemen or in Israel-Palestine or in Syria, but at the same time tries to connect these broader issues. We only meet 9 times, and so it's necessarily not very, you cannot go very deeply in any of these issues. But hopefully, at least it will be a good beginning in understanding. As far as the requirements of such a course, and I don't know how many of you have taken this kind of short course in the past, but your attendance is important, and I would like to encourage your participation so that I don't have to do all the talking, and I can do some of the listening. And I think it would be good. I don't know, again, I'm not sufficiently, I've never taught a course in Turkey before. I've given a lot of talks in Turkey at different events, but never had the opportunity to teach here. And I wanted to have, in order to evaluate your participation, partly it's your participation orally, but partly it is to do a 3,000 to 5,000, and not 3,000 to 5,000, that's increasing the burden of what I intended, which was a 2,500 to 3,000 word paper. And I'm not sure that with this number of students it'll work to have these short oral reports. But I'd like you to take a topic that somehow comes out of the syllabus, that is connected, and maybe by Friday, just give me a sheet of paper in which you tell me what topic you've chosen. Are there any questions about this, what I've been saying so far?
Will it be okay if we just listen?
Is what?
We're not taking the call.
Yes.
Will it be okay if we just listen?
You want to basically just audibly call? You
Just listen.
Listen, okay.
Will it be okay?
It's okay with me? It's okay with you?
Yeah.
Oh, good. No, that's fine. You feel free to participate if you wish. Anything, any other concerns or questions? Or any desires on your part?
So, do you speak about Sykes-Picot agreement? It is an interesting agreement. The Sykes-Picot.
Yes.
It is very interesting.
Yes. Well, I thought we would talk about that next time.
Oh.
And try to talk. The next session that we have is devoted to what I call the deep roots or the historic background of the present conflict. And it would be good. I think you all have copies of this. Sykes-Picot agreement, which was the agreement between Britain and France to divide the region, and my article and the Balfour Declaration. See, in my view, these two texts, it's sometimes very important to understand the sort of background of the present situation by looking at these sort of agreements or expressions by governments of what is intended as sort of a historical perspective on current issues. And I try to, in my essay that I asked you to look at, I tried to suggest that the troubles of the region are partly a consequence of the wrongdoing that occurred after World War I. So the region is suffering in large part from wrongs that were committed, diplomatic wrongs that were committed committed in the more than a century ago. And those who were responsible for these wrongs are completely without any accountability. They're completely outside the scope of who is blamed, who is held responsible. Let me just say a couple of words about the current context, because one of the things, again, about this region is the fact that it's constantly changing. It's like a kaleidoscope which you shake up, and every time you look at it, there's a different pattern. And I think if we had been meeting a month ago, Syria would have looked very different, and the relevance of the Kurdish issue would have been different, and the role of Russia and the United States in relation to Turkey, in relation to the region, would have looked very different. So it's important in thinking about what's happening here to remain very flexible in understanding that the unexpected is expected. That is, that it's so uncertain what the future will bring. And that uncertainty at this time is accentuated by the kind of leadership that the United States is providing under President Trump, who sort of glories in uncertainty. That uncertainty is his unpredictability, uncertainty is the governing style. And that's something new, and it doesn't fit in with global diplomacy or regional diplomacy very well. And it's a kind of joker in the deck of diplomatic happenings. So it's obviously of interest to people here in Turkey. What happens to this Operation Spring Peace? Does it really bring peace to the Turkish-Syrian border region? Is it a successful way of addressing terrorism in relation to Turkey? Should we be concerned that it's a military operation without the authorization of the United Nations and inconsistent with international law? See, one of the governing ideas in international law is that you can't use military force across an international border unless you're doing it in response to an attack in self-defense, or with the authority given by the UN Security Council. Neither of those things were present here. Yet, for many people, it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. So one has the question, what is more relevant? Reasonable behavior or these legal and institutional checks on what the government does? And our judgment about this Operation Spring Peace will depend on whether it works out. I mean, it's too soon to tell whether it is a successful initiative that creates stability at the border and in the broader region, or is a one more phase in a very destructive kind of pattern of conflict that has existed in Syria for the past 8 years. In other words, is it a conflict resolving initiative, or is it something that is just a stage in an unresolved conflict? And that's something that is very hard to determine at this point in time. The other thing that happened very recently is the use of American special forces with intelligence help from Turkey and from apparently Kurdish, some of the elements of the Kurdish community, possibly Russia, possibly Israel, in tracking the head of ISIS and finding him and killing him. Again, this is a use of military force by a foreign power without the justification of self-defense or any authorization from the UN. At the same time, it seems to have been accepted as a desirable development because of the logic of counterterrorism, that in a way creates justifications for ignoring normal law, normal legal restraints. It's viewed as a common threat, and ISIS, particularly because it was such a brutal form of terrorism, was seen as outside the framework of international legal accountability. In a way, it's somewhat similar to the manner in which piracy was treated in an earlier century. That pirates had no rights, and they could be addressed, they could be dealt with at the discretion of established governments. The world has become, in that sense, since the 9/11 attacks on the United States in 2001, the world has become a global battlefield. Wherever you find important, wherever you identify important terrorists, they can be attacked, and wherever they find a soft target, they will attack. So you have something that's very different than whatever existed before. You have conflict that's not geographically contained in states that are at war with each other, or a civil war that has occurred within a state. This is something new. Terrorism isn't new. It's been, in one form or another, practiced, but the transnational use of terrorism is something new. And what also is new is the capability of these extremist political groups to inflict warlike damage. In other words, all society, 9/11 came as a great shock to American society because it thought of itself as invulnerable because it was so strong militarily. But what was exhibited was that even something as simple as a box opener can become a weapon of not mass destruction, but of extreme symbolic value as a weapon that does major damage. So you've had a shift in the balance of forces that govern conflict without a shift in the mental attitudes or a shift in the political structure. It's still a world of territorial sovereign states, even though there's a global battlefield and there's new kind of weaponry on both sides, both the drones that are flying all over without even personnel involved, and missiles that can be used at a long distance accurately. And there are extremist political groups that can potentially inflict damage to the strongest of military powers. So it raises questions about the nature of power, the nature of security, that have not been really understood very well. So it's a very challenging time to understand what is happening in this region and how that relates to what's happening in the world. The Chinese have a proverb that it's a curse to live in interesting times. And from that perspective, I think we suffer from such a curse because we are living at a time when the future is very uncertain, not only from these kind of issues, but from things like climate change, the ecological dimension of political change. I've probably said enough for this introductory session, but if any of you have questions or comments, I'll do my best to answer them. If there are no such questions, you're free to enjoy the rest of the day. But it's important that you try to participate, for your sake, as well as mine. Or I'll force you to. All right? Making you come and ask questions. But we meet tomorrow at 10. You know,